1 year ago, this show started with a very simple, very dignified mission to rip the fig leaf off of the past. And somehow, after a full year of episodes, research, rabbit holes, disaster stories, ghostly tunnels, con men, bird wars, vanished aviators, volcanic tantrums, bad court decisions, and enough historical side eye to permanently strain a facial muscle, I can confidently report that the past is not wearing much underneath. Welcome to Naked History. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. This is not a regular episode where we pick one historical event, walk it into the center of the room, and shine a flashlight on it, and politely ask, what the hell happened here? Today, we are celebrating 1 year of the show. 1 full year of weird little doors opening into very big history. 1 year of learning that the strangest details are usually not distractions of the story, they are the story. They're the trapdoors, the fingerprints, the loose threads, the cursed little breadcrumbs that lead you from, that's odd, to, oh, no, this explains an entire society. And honestly, that's become the heart of the show. Naked History was never meant to be the kind of history podcast that walks into the room wearing elbow patches, saying, today, class, we will be discussing events of considerable significance, while everyone slowly dies inside. No, we are here for the drama. We're here for the humanity. We're here for the weirdness. And we're here for the fact that history is often tragic, frequently absurd, and occasionally inspiring, and almost always being made worse by someone with a title, a budget, and the confidence of a man who has never once asked, should I? So today, in honor of 1 year of this beautifully underdressed little history circus, we are opening the official Naked History Yearbook. That's right, the yearbook. The place where we honor the episodes, the moments, the disasters or decisions, and historical chaos goblins that help define year one of the show. There'll be awards, there'll be reflection, and there'll be personal feelings, because apparently I am not immune to those. There will be jokes, because if history wanted to be taken completely seriously, it should have made fewer decisions while wearing powdered wigs. So, grab your ceremonial fig leaf, sign someone's yearbook with "Stay weird, never accept spectral evidence," and let's look back at 1 year of naked history. And we're going to be starting off right at the top, because that intro that you heard is called In the West by Kevin MacLeod. You've probably heard it in various other places. It is a copyright-free soundbite that people can use. And unfortunately for me, it's probably been the most inconvenient sound I've ever used. Because even though I've written Kevin and gotten his permission and license for using that song, every single time I upload an episode, it is almost immediately flagged by another distribution center for being their copyright. And so I have to argue it, send it back to Spotify, and almost every single episode of this podcast has been sent through Spotify's verification system. So, first off, I just want to give some appreciation to Kevin MacLeod, because he's created such an incredible work of art that so many other people want to stop me from using. So, first of all, shout out Kevin MacLeod and his ability to write music that is instantaneously in the public zeitgeist and in the brainwaves of everyone who hears it. Now, when I started this show, I wanted it to feel a certain way. I wanted it to be accurate, obviously, because if you're going to drag the past into the light, you should at least make sure you're dragging the correct corpse. But I also wanted it to feel alive. I wanted history to sound less like a textbook and more like someone grabbing you by the sleeve and saying, you're not going to believe what humans got up to before indoor plumbing and better liability standards. Because that's the thing. History is not boring, and history has never been boring. History has been violent, strange, intimate, petty, breathtaking, cruel, brilliant, hilarious, and completely unhinged. But boring? No. If history feels boring, that usually means somebody sanded off the edges, drained out the blood, removed the jokes, hid the scandal, and left us with a paragraph so dry it could be used as kindling. This show has always been about putting the texture back in. The mud, the bones, the bad ideas, the emotional stakes, the weird human choices. The moments where you stop and say, I'm sorry, they did what? And the answer is yes, they definitely did that. And there are 3 sources, a plaque, and a probably gift shop mug you can buy. Now, over the last year, we've gone into catacombs, courtrooms, cockpits, battlefields, and everything in between of con jobs, volcanic winters, and one deeply embarrassing conflict between the Australian military and a flock of birds with the emotional energy of unpaid interns. And through it all, the mission has stayed the same. Big history with little doors that we look through. Entertaining without sacrificing accuracy. Curious, mischievous, and empathetic. We never glib about real tragedy, but we're never so stiff the past feels embalmed. Because the sweet spot, the place where this show lives, is where you can learn something real and still have fun getting there. So today is a celebration, yes, but also a little bit of a statement of purpose. This is what the show has been. This is what it's becoming, and this is why 1 year in, we're still here, still digging, still looking around at the history and saying, okay, but what are they hiding under the fig leaf? And friends, the answer remains a lot. Way too much. Frankly, history should be embarrassed. Now, every good yearbook needs superlatives. You remember superlatives, the most likely to succeed, the best smile, class clown, most likely to accidentally start a cult because they own a whiteboard. That kind of thing. But this is Naked History, so our categories are going to be a little bit different. Nobody here is winning Best Dressed, because again, fig leaf situation. Instead, we're honoring the stories that define the first year of the show. The episodes that made us laugh, the ones that made us stare at a wall, made us question municipal planning, or the ones that made us distrust tanks of syrup, and made us realize that some birds simply do not respect the chain of command. Now, I do want to say this is not a ranking. I'm not choosing favorite children, mostly because the children are things like mass panic, public safety failures, or a con man selling a national landmark. And I don't think legally I should be parenting any of those. So think of this as more as a guided tour through the Naked History class photo. Front row, disasters. Back row, mysteries. And off to the side, the emus refusing to stand where they're told. Somewhere in the middle is me, holding a stack of notes asking why every simple story turns into a 6-hour research spiral with 3 dead ends, 1 new obsession, and a sentence I will never emotionally recover from. So let's begin. The first award goes to a story that really helped define the show's tone, the Paris Catacombs. And that episode wins the most likely to haunt a tourist attraction, which in fairness is less of an award and more like an actual job description. The Paris Catacombs was one of those topics that sound like they were invented by a goth city planner with a sanitation problem and a flair for drama. Millions of bones stacked under one of the most beautiful cities in the world because eventually Paris had to admit that its cemeteries were overcrowded, leaking into everyday life, and generally behaving in ways that make the phrase urban planning sound like a threat. And that's why the story worked so well for Naked History. Because on the surface it's creepy. It's bones, it's tunnels, it's tourists walking through an underground corridor trying to act respectful while also absolutely taking photos for Instagram. It has atmosphere and it has dread. It has that very specific feeling of being somewhere you probably shouldn't be, but someone put up a ticket booth, so apparently it's fine. But underneath that, and pun very much intended, because if I can't make an underground bone joke here, what are we even doing? Underneath that, the catacombs are not just spooky wallpaper. They're a story about cities and about death, about sanitation and about memory, and how societies deal with the bodies they would prefer not to think about, until the bodies become a public health emergency and start making themselves impossible to ignore. Paris didn't wake up one morning and say, you know, what the city needs, a tasteful subterranean bone labyrinth. The catacombs came from pressure, from overcrowding, from disease fears, urban expansion, and the collision between a living city and the dead one beneath it. And that's where we live. Because yes, the weird detail is there's bones under Paris. But the bigger question is, what does a city bury and what happens when it can't keep it buried anymore? That is the Naked History doorway. We go in for skulls and we stay for the uncomfortable urban metaphor. And personally, I feel like this is one of the episodes where the show for the first time clicked into what it wanted to be. It was eerie, funny, reflective, and slightly disrespectful toward any city that handles infrastructure problems by saying, what if we made this horrifying but organized? Paris looked at death, overcrowding, public health, and somehow ended up with a tourist attraction where people can walk past carefully arranged femurs and say, this is beautiful, which is very French and very concerning. So congratulations to the Paris Catacombs, the most likely to haunt a tourist attraction. You are the reason I now look under every pretty city and wonder what is hiding underneath. Our next award goes to one of the purest examples of history walking into a room, dropping a file on the table, and saying, no, this really happened. The category is the best use of birds as military resistance, and the winner is obviously the Emu War. Now, the Emu War is one of those stories that sounds fake in the way that the best real stories do. You can say Australia went to war with emus, and people assume immediately that you are exaggerating for comedic effect. And then you have to say, no, technically there were soldiers, and there were machine guns, and there were farmers asking for help. There were actual military resources involved, and the birds didn't sign a peace treaty because they were too busy being ungovernable, feathered velociraptors. And that right there is why the episode belongs in the yearbook. Because the Emu War is funny. It is deeply funny. It is almost suspiciously funny, and there's something undeniable and satisfying about a group of large, fast, chaotic birds looking at armed humans and saying in their own silent emu way that your authority is not recognized in this district. But like all good Naked History stories, the absurdity is the doorway, not the whole house. Because behind the bird jokes, there was also a story about struggling farmers, many of them veterans trying to make life in difficult conditions. It was about land use, agriculture, government promises, and environmental disruption, and the very human habit of assuming that nature will respect our fences, schedules, and paperwork. Nature didn't. And the emus especially didn't. The emus showed up in numbers. They moved quickly and scattered when fired upon, and generally behaved less like an enemy army and more like a natural force with knees. And that's the thing I keep coming back to with this story. Humans love to make systems. We love boundaries and we love categories. We love saying, this land is for farming now, and then expecting every animal in the area to attend the zoning meeting. Well, the emus missed the meeting, or they attended and voted no. Either way, the result was chaos. From a storytelling standpoint, the Emu War is a gift because it lets us have a good time without pretending that context doesn't matter. We can laugh at the image of the military being outmaneuvered by giant birds, while also understanding that the reason anyone reached for that solution in the first place was because real people were under pressure. And that is also one of the trickiest balances in the show, and honestly, one of the things I'm proudest of when it works. The goal in Naked History is never to flatten real human problems into a punchline. The goal is to use the humor to get closer, not farther away. And the Emu War lets us do that beautifully. Because yes, it is absurd that soldiers with machine guns struggled against emus, but it's also revealing. It reveals how governments improvise, how rural communities get squeezed, and how environmental problems become political problems. And how sometimes in the grand machinery of human authority, runs face first into a bird with no respect for hierarchy and loses the vibe immediately. So congratulations to the emus, the best use of birds as military resistance. No government, only legs. Now our next category is one that I truly wish did not have to exist. It is the Stickiest Public Safety Disaster. And yes, the winner is the Great Molasses Flood. This is another one of those historical sentences that feels like a joke until you sit with it for longer than 3 seconds and realize, oh, people died. Like, this is not whimsical. This was not a charming little syrup mishap. This was a deadly industrial disaster caused by negligence, ignored warnings, weak oversight, and the kind of corporate confidence that should make everyone in a 10-block radius nervous. A massive tank of molasses burst in Boston's North End in 1919, sending a wave throughout the streets with enough force to crush buildings, sweep people away, and turn an ordinary neighborhood into something out of a nightmare that had been catered by a pancake restaurant. And that tonal whiplash is exactly why the story stuck with me, because Molasses Flood sounds funny. It sounds like the setup of a joke. It sounds like something a cartoon mayor would have to address at a press conference. And it sounds like a disaster that should involve a raccoon, a banjo, and a town council meeting that got out of hand. But then you read the details. The speed of the wave, the force of the wave, the scream of the victims, the horses, the families, the wreckage, the smell lingering in the neighborhood for years after, and the years of legal aftermath as well. The fact that people had noticed problems with the tank before it failed, and suddenly the joke curdles. And that's an important Naked History lesson. The weirdest disasters are often not random, they are built. They are assembled piece by piece through bad decisions, ignored complaints, rushed construction, weak regulation, and people with power deciding that the risk is acceptable because someone else will be standing closer to the tank if it explodes. Molasses should not have a body count. Feels like a sentence society should have prevented, but it did. And the reason this episode belongs in the anniversary yearbook is because it captured something this show keeps returning to. History is often most revealing when the thing that happened sounds impossible. A wave of molasses killing people in Boston sounds impossible, and then once you understand it, it becomes disturbingly possible. It becomes a story about industrial America, about immigrant neighborhoods, about corporate responsibility, and about the cost of speed and profit, and who gets listened to and who gets ignored until the tank bursts. And that's the part that matters. The absurd detail gets us through the door, but the human cost makes us pay. And that's something I've learned again and again over the last year. The stories that seem weird are rarely just weird. They're weird because they expose the seams. They show us where the system failed and where people were dismissed and where danger was normalized, where someone probably said, it'll be fine, which is historically one of the most dangerous sentences in the English language. So congratulations and condolences to the Great Molasses Flood, the stickiest public safety disaster. A story that proves history can be sweet, deadly, and legally complicated, which is also how I describe some family reunions. The next award goes to an episode that took one of my favorite kinds of historical doors, the kind that starts with weather and ends with everybody's life getting worse. The category is most likely to ruin everyone's summer, and the winner is obviously Mount Tambora. This story was huge. It's one of those topics where the more you pull on a thread, the more the entire sweater starts coming apart. The volcano erupts in what is now Indonesia, and the eruption blasts material into the atmosphere. The climate shifts, temperatures drop, and weather patterns go sideways. Crops fail, food prices rise, and people move. Communities struggle, and disease spreads. And eventually, literature gets gothic. Mary Shelley ends up in a gloomy villa with bad weather and excellent nightmare fuel. And suddenly, a volcanic eruption becomes a global story. And that is big history through a weird little door. Because the weird little door is, why was there a year where summer basically forgot to show up? But the bigger story is about connection. It's about how something happening on the other side of the planet can reach into kitchens, farms, markets, villages, and imaginations somewhere else. It's about how climate is not necessarily background scenery, it's an actor in history. A very dramatic actor, I might add. The kind that enters in Act 2, kills the harvest, ruins the lighting, and demands top billing. Now, Tambora erupted so hard it basically reached across the planet and canceled summer like a petty weather god. And that's fun phrasing, but the consequences were very realistically brutal. People went hungry and families struggled. Communities faced cold, wet, and failed growing seasons, and in some places snow and frost arrived at times when crops should have been thriving. The kind of disruption that does not stay in a weather report, it becomes a food crisis. It becomes a migration story, it becomes a political pressure cooker. It becomes art, or may even come fear. And from a podcast perspective, this is one of those episodes that really showed me how much I love stories where the scale keeps expanding. You start in one place with one event, then the camera pulls back and then it pulls back again, and suddenly you're not telling the story of one volcano, you're telling the story of a planet connected by air, food, trade, disease, imagination, and vulnerability. And that's the kind of history that I love. Not because it's neat. I mean, it is not neat. It's a corkboard with strings going everywhere, and one of the pins is labeled Weather Ruined Everything. But it shows how the world works. It reminds us that human history is not just kings and wars and treaties. It's also rainfall and temperature, harvests, hunger, houses, roads, rumors, poems written because everyone else was trapped inside and miserable. And honestly, if there's one lesson from a year without a summer, it's that the weather is never just small talk. Sometimes the weather is the plot. So congratulations to Mount Tambora, the most likely to ruin everyone's summer. A volcano so dramatic it gave the Northern Hemisphere seasonal trust issues. Our next award goes to a man who walked into American folklore wearing sunglasses, carrying a briefcase, and refusing to give us closure. The category is Best Disappearing Act Without a Rabbit, and the winner is D.B. Cooper. Now, I love a mystery episode, but D.B. Cooper has a very specific flavor of mystery. It is cool, it's cinematic, it's smoky, it's a crime story that looks like it should be leaning against a jukebox in a raincoat. A man buys a plane ticket under the name Dan Cooper, boards a Northwest Orient flight in 1971, orders a drink, passes a note that says he has a bomb. He gets ransom money and some parachutes, then releases the passengers and jumps out of the back of the plane into the night somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, and then just vanishes. No confirmed body, no confirmed identity, no clean ending, just fragments. Money is found later. There's suspects and theories, and weather and terrain, ideals brought into scope, but cigarette butts that were lost before DNA testing could have its moment, and a case file that becomes less like a solved crime and more like a national campfire story. And D.B. Cooper is exactly what happens when a mystery has enough evidence to feel real and exactly enough blank space for everyone to project their favorite version onto it. Was he a genius? Was he desperate? Was he lucky? Did he die that night? Did he somehow survive and spend the rest of his life quietly mowing a lawn somewhere while America turned him into a folk anti-hero? Well, that's why the story works. Because D.B. Cooper is less of a person and more of a silhouette. And silhouettes are dangerous for history. They invite imagination and they let people fill in the face however they want. Some people want him to be a criminal mastermind. Some want him to be a doomed fool. Some want him to just be an ordinary guy who pulled something extraordinary. And some want him to be a symbol of rebellion against the system, which is one of those interpretations that sounds a lot cooler if you don't think too hard about the passengers who were, on a hijacked airplane. But that's the tension. The history and story are undeniably compelling. It has style, it has atmosphere, and has that perfect American cocktail of crime, aviation crash, weather, and unsolved identity. But it also asks us to be careful. Because mystery can glamorize and folklore can sand down fear. The longer a story sits in the cultural imagination, the easier it is to forget that D.B. Cooper became a legend. He was a man who threatened people on an airplane. That's very Naked History tension, too. We can enjoy the strange, stylish, cinematic shape of the story without pretending that the crime was harmless. We can lean into the mystery without turning people on that plane into props. We can say this story is fascinating, while also saying let's not get dazzled by the sunglasses that we forget the actual bomb threat. And personally, that's one of the reasons I like covering some mysteries on this show, not because I'm going to solve them. I'm not wandering out of this podcast with a flashlight and a corkboard to track down D.B. Cooper wide open. I have errands, and gas is expensive. But mysteries reveal what we want from history. They show us an appetite for closure, a love of ambiguity, and a tendency to turn missing information into mythology. And our habit of mistaking unknown for anything is possible, including my uncle's theory from Facebook. So congratulations to D.B. Cooper, the best disappearing act without a rabbit. A man who jumped out of a plane into the most suspicious corner of American folklore. Our next category is a little less tidy because there are multiple contenders. The category is the most surprisingly emotional episode. And honestly, this is the category that best explains why I keep doing the show. Because a lot of Naked History episodes start with a hook that sounds ridiculous or eerie or strange. Bones under Paris, birds versus soldiers, a deadly wave of molasses, a vanished hijacker, or a summer ruined by a volcano. or even a woman trying to fly around the world and disappearing over the Pacific. And you start with a thing that makes people lean in, but if you do the story right, something else happens. The weirdness opens up, and suddenly there are people there. Real people. Scared people, brave people, foolish people, grieving people, ambitious people, even. People trying to survive conditions that they did not choose. People making mistakes, and people living inside systems that are bigger than them. People getting crushed by decisions made in offices that they were never invited to. And that's the part that sneaks up on you. The Paris Catacombs start with bones, but eventually you're thinking about how a city remembers its dead. The Year Without a Summer starts with strange weather, but eventually you're thinking about hunger, displacement, fear, and creativity under pressure. The Great Molasses Flood starts with a sentence that sounds absurd, but eventually you're thinking about families, workers, immigrants, and a neighborhood hit by a disaster that should have been prevented. However, if there's one episode that sits with me personally, it starts with Laika. Laika starts with the strange, almost storybook image of a little dog in a space capsule, and then absolutely ruins you. Because behind the Cold War headlines and the shiny space race language was a living creature who did not volunteer, who did not understand the mission, and was sent into orbit knowing full well there was no plan to bring her home. And that one got me. And honestly, it's getting me a little bit right now. I can joke about history all day, but Laika is one of those stories where the microphone suddenly feels heavier. You go in thinking, space dog, and you remember, no, this was a real animal, scared and alone, turned into a symbol by people who were chasing firsts faster than they were asking whether they should. And that episode made me cry. There's certain parts of the recording that you can hear it, not in a cinematic, noble, or single-tier way, mainly in a, well, I guess we're going to be emotionally compromised by a Soviet dog today kind of way. And that's what I mean when I say this show is here to have a good time, but not at the expense of other people or creatures in the story. We can joke, and we should joke. Humor is part of how we stay awake in the room with the past. It gives listeners a handhold, and it keeps the story human. It lets us approach difficult things without making the whole episode feel like we're locked in a basement with a textbook and a single flickering bulb. But the jokes always have to point upward or sideways or at the absurd machinery of power. They can never punch down to the people who were already getting flattened by history. And that's been one of the biggest lessons of Year One. The tone works best when it's mischievous but not cruel, sharp, not cheap, funny but still aware that some of the parts of the past bleed when you touch them. And I'll be honest, some of these stories have stayed with me way more than I expected. Because you research something because it sounds fascinating. And then halfway through, you realize you're not just building an episode, you're sitting with people. Or with Laika, you're sitting with this tiny, awful truth. Progress can be inspiring and still have victims. And you're trying to do right by them. You're trying to make the story entertaining enough for someone to press play, but thoughtful enough that when they finish, they carry something real with them. And that's the magic trick. You come for the historical nonsense, and you leave with feelings. Which, frankly, feels like a breach of contract, but here we are. So the award for most surprising emotional episode does not go to just one story. It goes to the pattern that kept showing up all year. The realization that behind every weird historical doorway there are human beings, and sometimes a little dog in a capsule. And they deserve more than a punchline, even when the punchline is like really, really good. Our next category might be the most important one in the whole yearbook. It is the best reminder that history has a supporting cast, because if this first year of Naked History has taught me anything, it's that history loves a main character. History loves a big name, a face on the poster, a person in the title, the one who gets the statue, the headline, the documentary thumbnail, or the dramatic reenactment where someone stares in the middle distance while strings play underneath. But reality is almost never that clean. Reality is a group project, and usually half the people who did the work are just standing outside the frame. And that came through very clearly in the Amelia Earhart story with Fred Noonan. Earhart is the icon, and Earhart is the name that everybody knows. Earhart is the Leather jacket, the short hair, the sky, the disappearance, and the myth. She earned her place in history, but she didn't vanish alone. Fred Noonan was there, a skilled navigator, a man with years of maritime and aviation experience, and a person whose expertise was central to the flight and whose life also ended in that mystery. But in the popular memory, he often becomes a comma: Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. And that's how history does it. One person becomes the monument and another becomes the inscription. And once you notice that pattern, you see it everywhere. You see it in exploration stories where one or two names become shorthand for entire networks of guides, laborers, translators, local experts, support crews, families, and communities. You see it in war stories where generals get remembered by ordinary soldiers who become numbers. You see it in disaster stories where executives and officials may be named, but workers and residents are reduced to victims in a photograph. You see it in social movements, where a few leaders become symbols while thousands of people who did the daily, dangerous, unglamorous work made that change possible. And you see it in the kinds of stories Naked History keeps returning to, because the weird little door often opens into a very crowded room. The Paris Catacombs are not just about bones, they're about workers who moved them, officials who planned it, and the mourners who lost the original resting places of the people they love. In a city full of living residents not trying to think too hard about what was underfoot. History wants to simplify, and this show should complicate. Not to make things confusing, but to make them honest. Because when you bring the supporting cast back into the story, the past becomes less like mythology and more like life. Because that's what history was, and is, honestly, messy, crowded, and uneven. Full of people doing their best, and people definitely doing their worst, and people who deserve better than to be left in the footnotes because one famous name took up all the oxygen. So this award goes to every episode that reminded us to widen the frame, to look for the person beside the icon, to look for the workers behind the disaster, the communities that built the headline, and the people that did not get a statue but absolutely carried the weight. History loves the main character, but reality keeps showing us that it's a group project. And honestly, after 1 year of this show, I think that may be one of the most Naked History ideas there is. Now, we're moving into the reflective portion of the anniversary special, which means if you're allergic to sincerity, please take a deep breath. I promise we won't stay here long enough to form a committee, but I do think it's worth saying that this show has taught me a lot over 1 year. First, it's taught me that history is almost as never clean as people want it to be. We love simple stories. We love a simple black and white heroes and villains, a beginning and ending, causes and effects, and nice little boxes with labels. We love the version of history that fits neatly onto a plaque because plaques don't usually have room for "it was complicated and everyone was kind of a mess." But the real stories are very rarely that tidy. Second, this show has taught me that the weird detail is often the way in. A lot of people think that weird history is just trivia, like it's the fun fact you say at a party right before someone decides they need to refill their drink in the other room. But weird details matter. They break open bigger stories, like how the Molasses Flood is not just a bizarre disaster, it's a doorway into a look of industrial America. The war with emus is not just a meme, it's a doorway into land, agricultural, veterans, and human arrogance. And the weird detail is on the handle of the door. That's what I love about the show. We don't have to choose between entertaining and meaningful. The strange thing can be a path to the serious thing. The joke can lead to the truth, and the absurdity can show us where the system cracked. And also, thirdly, this show has taught me that humor is not the enemy of serious history. Bad humor is, lazy humor definitely is, and punching down is. Treating tragedy like spectacle is. But humor itself, humor absolutely is a tool to forward history. It can invite people in, and it can help us process the absurdity of human behavior. It can keep a story from becoming so heavy that listeners shut down, and it can point out hypocrisy, arrogance, incompetence, and industrial and institutional nonsense with a sharpness that a plain summary can't. History is full of people making decisions that deserve to be roasted. although carefully and accurately, but definitely with seasoning. If a powerful man looks at a crisis and decides the best response is to make it worse, well, I reserve the right to verbally throw the tomato at him. It's not disrespecting history, that is just participating in civic life. And fourth up, this show has taught me that the past is never really past. It sounds like something someone would say in a very serious documentary while standing in a field at sunset, but unfortunately it's true. The stories we cover this year are not sealed away, they leave fingerprints. Disasters shape neighborhoods, myths shape memory, and monuments shape identity. Court failures echo into how we think about evidence and panic. Climate events remind us how fragile human systems can be. Stories of ambition, fame, risk, and disappearance still shape how we talk about gender, celebrity, exploration, and the cost of being first. The past keeps showing up, sometimes as a warning and sometimes as a ghost. Sometimes, though, as a very large bird refusing to be governed. And finally, this show has taught me that people like history more than they think they do. Because they don't always get the version of history that we were handed. Because when you give people the stakes, the weirdness, the humor, the humanity, and the wait, what moments, they lean in. They care, and they remember. They tell somebody else, hey, did you know that Boston got hit by a deadly wave of molasses? And then, ideally, they add, but it was actually about corporate negligence, because we're not monsters. And that is the show. That's the mission. Make it fun enough to enter and make it true enough to matter. And after 1 year, I can confidently say that history is not a straight line. It's a drunk raccoon in a museum gift shop. And apparently I've decided to follow it around with a microphone. So here we are. 1 year of Naked History. 1 year of cold opens, weird facts, dramatic music cues, too many tabs open for sure, and maybe some suspiciously specific Google searches. And me learning that if you research history long enough, eventually every topic becomes connected to weather, money, death, or someone refusing to admit they've made a mistake. This show has been a joy to make. Not always easy, I will definitely say. Definitely not always simple as well. Sometimes the research spirals. Sometimes the tone is hard to find, and sometimes the story starts as fun historical nonsense, and then suddenly I'm sitting there with notes everywhere, thinking, oh, this is actually about grief, state violence, and public memory. Cool. Very casual. But that's the work. And it's the fun of it too, because the past is not just one thing. It's ridiculous and devastating. It's intimate and enormous, and it's made of systems and accidents and choices and people. It's full of villains who need accountability and heroes who need complication. Victims who deserve names, and side characters who should have been in the frame the whole time. And over the first year, if Naked History has done anything right, I hope it has made the past feel alive. Not polished and not embalmed, but alive. With dirt under its nails, a questionable alibi, and a story it probably should have told us sooner. So to everyone who has listened, shared, reviewed, commented, or recommended the show, or simply tolerated me saying rip the fig leaf off the past with increasing confidence over the last year, thank you. Seriously, thank you, because a podcast can start as one person talking into a microphone, but it becomes something real when people decide to listen. And you have. You followed me into underground bone tunnels, across cursed marathon routes, through sticky disaster zones, into Puritan courtrooms, and across the Pacific, up mountains and into mysteries, and directly into the path of militant emus. And that is trust, or judgment. Possibly both, but either way, I'm grateful. Year 1 was about finding the show. Finding the rhythm, finding out how much snark is enough snark, how much drama is too much drama, and how many times I can make a joke about historical men with bad ideas before it becomes less of a joke and more of an academic framework. In year 2, we keep going. More little weird doors, more big human messes, and more people forgotten that are pulled back into the frame. More stories that start with "this sounds fake" and end with "oh no, that explains everything." More history with the fig leaf firmly removed. Because after 1 year, I can say this with complete confidence. The past is still weird, and the past is still messy. And the past is still hiding things. And we are still deeply and professionally nosy. So, for 1 year, I have been Dyllan Gassaway, and this has been Naked History, where we rip the fig leaf off the past, hand out yearbook awards to disasters, and remind you that history is not boring. It just needs better lighting. And fewer pants. So happy 1 year, everybody. Now let's go make you two even weirder.